Howdy, my name is Forrest, and I love SQL Server. I also love breaking SQL Server, mostly on purpose. And in the midst of all the chaos I cause, I've had to learn a little bit about error handling. So that's what today's video is about, an introduction to error handling in SQL Server. Let's get started. I'm going to create a table that's easy to cause errors with. It has a single column, and that column does not accept nulls. Okay, what do you think is going to happen when I run these three statements together? Notice that the first one inserts the value 1, that's okay. The third one inserts the value 3, also not a problem. But that middle statement there tries to insert a null and will generate an error. Let's find out. All right, we get an error, but if we examine the table, we see that the values 1 and 3 did successfully get inserted. What if we try wrapping it in a transaction? Okay, let's clear the table, and then let's add begin tran and commit. Okay, run it, and it looks similar so far. It is. Even though there was an error inside of transaction, both values 1 and 3 made it in. Does this always happen? Does SQL Server always just ignore errors and keep going? Let's look at a variant here. Here we have, instead of inserting a null, we're trying to create the table again. Now, politicians still exist, so creating this table again will cause an error. But let's see what happens when we run this all together. Here we go. We see one row affected and then error. There's already an object named politicians in the database. How scary. So if we look at the table, we can see that the value 1 made it in just fine, but 3 never did. What happened was this error killed the batch, and SQL Server didn't bother executing anything afterwards. This is also good to look at inside of a transaction. So let's remember to clear the table, and then we try it again. It looks similar with one row affected and then the error message, but when we look at the table, we see that it's empty. The transaction was rolled back when it hit the error. Okay, that is pretty useful, knowing what will cause SQL Server to abort when it hits an error, and that's controlled by the exact abort setting. So if we go back to that original error trying to insert a null value, but if we do it with exact abort on, it'll imitate the previous example. Okay, so I'm going to run this all together without using a transaction, and let's see what happens. We see one row affected, we see the error, and if we look at the table, we can see that value 1. And also similar, if we add in the transaction, and let's not forget to delete from the table, we see one row affected, we see the error, and if we select from the table, nothing. So set exact abort on causes an error to terminate execution and immediately roll back. All right, that's not the only way to handle an error. SQL Server also has try-catch blocks. Let's take a look at those. So here we have those three statements again. These are within the try block, begin, try, end try. And then you can also have a catch block where you perhaps put some logic. Okay, let's make sure that table is empty, and then let's run the try catch. Okay, we see these rows affected messages. What does the table look like? If we look at the table, we can see that one row made it in. All right, just the first one. All right. When the try block hits an error, it immediately goes to the catch block. All right. Although, even though there was an error, this first statement still committed. All right. Let's look at it with a transaction. All right. So we're going to stick all of these into a transaction. We have the begin tran here, and in what is almost certainly a bad practice, we stick a commit inside of the catch block. Let's empty out the table and see what happens here. And looking at the table, again, we only see that first row. Only the first insert shows up. Now, something really important to notice here is that when the try catch block runs, even if there's an error, like I'm doing this again, let's see it. We know there's an error. This one does not succeed. But there's no error message because we catch it. What can we do about that? Well, there's also a throw statement. So let's clear out the table and I'll show you how that works. So when there's an error, you can use this throw statement in the catch section. Now you do have to use a semicolon in front of it. So let's take a look. Again, there's the insert of a null, which should fail. We run this, and even though there's the catch block, we get to see the error. Cannot insert the value null. Okay? Now, that's not the only way to throw an error message. There also happens to be raise error in SQL Server, or raiser. The deal is, like, there's kind of a missing E in there, so I don't know how to pronounce it. I'll just call it raise error. And you can raise an error with it. It's kind of simple, maybe. Okay. Anyways, there's one other really interesting thing about SQL Server transactions that I want to highlight. A transaction has this transaction count associated with it. And every time you start a transaction, that increases the transaction count by 1. So you may think of nested transactions. What they're really doing, they're just increasing that transaction count by 1. Every time you run a commit, that lowers the transaction count by 1, except if you have a rollback, no matter how nested your transactions are, it brings you back to 0. And, well, it rolls everything back. So, again, remember, SQL Server never has a partially committed transaction. It's all or nothing. And it's only ever fully committed, which is committed at all, when the count reaches 0. Okay? Have fun generating your own errors.